As you know, we had some technical difficulties earlier. We had to reverse the order of the roundtable sessions. We had those who were present who enabled us to resume our program. Now we are here for the second part of the morning until 1 p.m. At 1 p.m. we will go outside the building to have a group picture. I'll repeat this at the end of the session. In the meantime, we're going to be able to exchange here. If the remote link works, we will have Corrine Le Quéré and Jean-Louis Bergey on my right, and Claire Tutenuit, who is on my left-hand side. I'd like to express the apologies of Thierry Philipponnat, who was not able to stay with us at this time. And I thank Claire Tutenuit, who was supposed to take part in the roundtable session we had earlier, for being present here now. So, obviously, we try to find solutions. As Thierry was saying, we're going to have three different complementary visions. First, Corrine Le Quéré, who is president of the French High Council on Climate, who's also a professor of climate change sciences at the University of East Anglia. And so, because of her scientific experience, she's going to enlighten us on a number of subjects that we have all heard about. So, and this concerns obviously the new IPCC report. Then we will look towards the future. We will talk about the energy scenario and carbon neutrality and how we've been reflecting on this in France for some time now, with a presentation of the work that was done by the French Agency for Environmental Transition, the ADEME. And we will project ourselves towards 2050 with Mr. Bergey, Jean-Louis Bergey, and then we will continue with our perception of energy, how to change these perceptions, and we will look at the question of advertising with Claire Tutenuit, who in fact is a Delegate General of Enterprises for the Environment. So Corrine, are you with us?
Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Yes. Good morning. Do you hear me? Yes, we hear you. And we see you. Excellent. Thank you for giving me the floor here. I'm Corrine Le Quéré. I'm president of the High Council for Climate. This is an independent entity which was created in the French Energy and Climate Law in 2019, which is entrusted with assessing the French government's policy on the subject of climate. So I'm going to talk about where we are in terms of our answer to climate change. So I'm going to try to share with you my screen so that you can see my presentation. Do you still hear me? Yes, we still hear you. And do you see this my screen share? Yes. Perfect.
Donc, allons-y. Donc, comme vous le savez, le réchauffement climatique continue. Nous avons maintenant 1,2 degré
Today
de
we have
réchauffement global,
1.2 degrees
1,7 degré
global
en France.
heating
C'est
and 1.7 plus 1.7 degrees
qui va
in
clairement
France.
au-delà de la
This
variabilité naturelle
warming is obviously
du globe.
greater than
L'année
the
2020 a été
natural
l'année la plus
variability.
chaude en Europe,
2020 was the hottest
2021 dans
year
les 5
in Europe
années les plus chaudes.
recorded.
Donc, clairement, au niveau
2021 was in the
européen
top
aussi, on a un
5 warmest
réchauffement
years.
très évident.
So it's clear
Les
that we
impacts,
have
comme
a
vous l'avez dit
veritable
dans le dernier rapport
warming.
du GIEC,
As far as the
les
impact,
impacts
as indicated by the IPCC
sont
report,
généralisés et
the effects
irréversibles
are
pour certains de
harmful,
ces
they're
impacts,
general and
avec
irreversible,
maintenant
with
3,5
some
milliards de
3.5
personnes qui
billion
sont
people who are
vulnérables.
considered
Au
vulnerable
niveau
to this
des
change.
émissions, pour arrêter
Now,
le réchauffement de
so
la
as
planète,
to
il faut
stop
que les
this
émissions
global
de
warming,
CO2 et de gaz à effet de serre de
CO2
long terme
emissions and
atteignent la neutralité
greenhouse
carbone.
gas
Et en
emissions
ce moment, en
be
fait, ces
reduced
émissions
to attain
continuaient
carbon
d'accroître
neutrality.
avant la crise du
Now,
Covid-19.
while
Les réponses de la pandémie ont induit une chute temporaire des émissions,
pandemic
puis un
had
rebond
led to
en
a
2021
temporary
à
drop
cause
in
de faute de
the
changements
emissions, but there was a
structurels.
rebound in
Donc,
global
on est
emissions
encore
because
loin
there
de
were
la
no
trajectoire
structural
nécessaire
changes.
pour atteindre la
So we're
neutralité
far
carbone.
from the
Par
trajectory
contre, des
necessary
avancées
to
notables
achieve carbon
sont
neutrality.
survenues à la COP26
However,
à Glasgow à l'automne
meaningful
dernier.
progress was
Déjà,
made
l'accord de
at the
Paris est maintenant
COP26.
opérant. Il s'est
Today you
imposé
have the
comme
Paris
cadre de
Agreement,
référence
which
des
is
négociations
operational, and it has
internationales sur le
imposed
climat.
itself as a
Les avancées dans le
framework
pacte de
reference
Glasgow
for international
incluent la
negotiations on
finalisation de
climate.
l'accord de Paris,
Now,
les nouveaux
the
engagements
advances
des
made,
pays.
what we can
Plus de
talk about are
130
the
pays qui ont pris des
Glasgow
engagements de
Pact, the
neutralité
finalization
carbone
of the
et
Paris
33
Agreement, Articles 6 and
initiatives qui ont été
13,
lancées,
new
dont 18
commitments
rejointes
for
par la
reduction,
France.
CDN,
Par
130
contre, la
countries
somme
and
des
more
nouvelles
have
ambitions
made
ne permet pas
commitments
de
to
limiter
reach
le
carbon
réchauffement
neutrality.
à 1,5
33 initiatives
degré.
have
On est
been launched,
encore loin de
18 joined by
l'objectif de
France. The
température.
sum of new
Et donc, le
ambitions
pacte
will
de
not enable
Glasgow
us to
demande
limit
aux
global
pays
warming to
signataires
1.5
de
degrees.
revoir à
So
la
the
hausse leurs
Glasgow Pact
ambitions pour
asks the
2030
signatory
d'ici
countries to
2022,
review
donc déjà cette année,
their
lors de la
ambitions for
COP27.
2030, and this
Où en
as of
est-on au niveau
2022.
de l'implémentation?
So
Les émissions
where
de
are
gaz à
we
effet de
in
serre
terms of
diminuent. Donc, je vous montre
the
ici,
implementation of the
l'état de la
agreement? We have seen there's a
France,
decrease
diminue de
in
manière systématique
greenhouse
depuis
gas
plus d'une
emissions.
décennie.
For example,
On
in
voit cette
France, we can see that they have been
tendance dans 23 pays à l'heure
decreasing for the
actuelle.
last decade and more,
Cette
but this
diminution qui a
decrease is
atteint
going to have to
1,9%
accelerate.
en France en 2019, juste
And
avant
we see
les
that for
événements
France,
associés à la crise du
the
Covid.
drop in emissions have accelerated, an objective of minus 3.3% per year for the 2024-2028 period. And in fact, going back a minute to 2019, we saw there was a minus 1.9% in emissions and a drop of minus 9% in 2020, but that was just a temporary situation linked to COVID-19. Now, how can France accelerate its reduction in emissions? We are in a very important phase today. This is a strategic preparation phase, and it's important that a climate strategy be deployed to mitigate the emissions, and this is be done everywhere. In this strategy, we need to clarify the objectives that need to be implemented. For all of this, we need to reinforce the governance and financing and monitoring of decisions made within the government, and this for the long term. The situation is quite similar at the European level. Here you see the trends for Germany, the UK, Italy, Spain, and France. we see that at the European Union level, there has been a decrease of 23% of emissions between 1990 and 2018. But this has especially been achieved by the energy sector, with significant contribution by the construction sector and industry. However, as far as transportation is concerned, for example, and agriculture are concerned, no countries have really achieved significant progress. You see that there are opportunities to react within the countries, but also within Europe as a whole. Now, the mechanisms of the European market do not prevent us from having to implement policies specifically regarding the environment. Now, what about the recommendations of the High Council on Climate? Well, the Hcc recommendations to the government call for the respect of the accompaniment of European climate objectives, including the finalization as fast as possible of the Fit for 55 package, reinforce the governance and means implemented, as well as the steering tools necessary to achieve objectives in France. Is a question of reforming, in fact, the ETS, and this means there has to be an end to free quotas while protecting companies, and this is with the MACF. We have to act in all sectors with regards to the ETS and the decisions that have to be implemented. We also have to make the European budgetary framework more flexible for investments, public investments, which are identified as being necessary for the transition. Now, these recommendations are quite general, but they are essential. At the same time, the structure established by the French government and other governments to create, in fact, these independent councils is bearing fruit, and as a consequence, the International Climate Council's network was launched at the time of the Glasgow COP26. Today there are some 21 entities, and this is co-presided by the French Hcc in 2022 in collaboration with the Climate Councils of Guatemala and Canada. This is based on 5 key principles. First of all, scientific rigor based on multidisciplinary expertise. Secondly, the information and opinion which are independent and founded on factual data that taken into account of the socioeconomic aspects of transition, impartial consultation by the stakeholders concerned, and at the same time adopting mitigation, adaptation, and just transition measures. All of this, in fact, to facilitate the exchange of good practices between councils and the support of the creation of a climate council for the world. Thank you very much, and that's all I had to say. We would like to thank you for these very clear words expressed here. If you have a bit of time to spend with us, we'll come back to you for questions at the end of the presentations by the other speakers. Yes, of course. So at this point, we can turn to Jean-Louis Bergey from the French Agency for Ecological Transition, the ADEME, and the Transition 2050 program. Good morning. I would like to talk to you about the work that we have carried out at ADEME. This is a forward-looking study. What we've tried to do is identify the different scenarios towards this carbon neutrality, since we all have the objective of being carbon neutral in 2050. And Yes? We have a slideshow. We have slides. Is it possible? Can we have the slides, please? Now, you know that carbon neutrality is fine. It's a concept, but for decision makers, be they political, company managers, etc., what does it mean? What does it mean to achieve carbon neutrality? So, this is the presentation by EPE. Could we have the ADEME slides? Now, the idea here was that we would try to materialize what the attainment of carbon neutrality would be, not by proposing one single possibility or trajectory, but rather by proposing 4 different scenarios with an educational approach. So if you want to commit to a given trajectory, here are the advantages and here are the limits of these scenarios. We started this work 3 years ago in the spring of 2019, and the objective was to publish in the fall of 2021 the work that had been done so as to be able to put some elements on the table within the framework of the 2022 presidential election campaign. We were not the only ones to do this, because you need to know that the French electricity transmission company did this as well. And you have another project that was also presented. There's an association called Megawatt, which also made proposals. And this for the autumn of 2022, we wanted to be able to give elements for reflection. I get the impression that, is there a problem? It's called Transition 2050, the slide show. Now, how have we worked here? We started with the 4 archetypical scenarios given by the IPCC, and we transposed this to metropolitan France. We didn't work on the overseas départements and territories because of the differences there. What we did was sketch out the differences between these archetypical societies in 2050. Then we worked on a sectorial basis to try to look at what this implied for different sectors like industry, agriculture, food, the waste treatment sector, construction, transport, etc. Then we tried to verify whether or not the proposal was coherent, was consistent. Then we put all of the information in a databases, and we were able to see that none of the 4 scenarios allowed us to reach carbon neutrality. So then we reworked this to see how we could achieve carbon neutrality. It is clear that there were certain calculation errors over 30 years, but the idea was to give elements for thought. So we were able to reach a work which was published end of November 2021. It was supplemented, obviously, because we are lacking the macroeconomic impact. Also, what this did to certain sectors, the digital sector, 5 different sectors that we worked on with professionals. We questioned a group of 31 people to describe each of the scenarios to them and then get their feedback, to have a certain social individual feedback on these scenarios and not just have the feedback from technicians and experts on the subject. We also looked at the calculations in terms of footprint, greenhouse gases, etc. So last week we worked with the electrical and medical aspects of the energy transition. The other work will be done in March and May. So as far as these 4 scenarios are concerned, they're very different, highly contrasted. Once again, this is of pedagogical interest. The first of these scenarios, normally you would see a slide and you would see 4 different scenarios, S1, S2, S3, S4, with 7 key words linked to each scenario. The first scenario is called the Frugal Generation, where we really see changes in lifestyles. I think we're finally getting this slide. Okay. So, okay, can we see this scenario? Fine. So the first of these is the Frugal Generation. This is a scenario where we will consume 2 times less energy than in 2015, with very strong evolution here. Here, for example, we see you're consuming 3 times less meat than today. We are in a massive renovation of existing buildings, a lot less of new construction. And we also have reinvestment in the rural areas, medium-sized cities. We decrease daily trips by a factor of 3. Plane travel limited to what is essential only. And this is possible thanks to 3 levers that we use in the 4 scenario. The first of this is constraint. That is, say, there will be measures adopted, which, for example, is going to lead to a reduction of speeds on motorways, different fiscal types of incentives to force people to limit their consumption of goods and services and thus energy. And we're going to explain to people that they need to have a more frugal approach to consumption, limited to what their needs. And then there's the technical aspect which exists. We're going to be more low-tech, even though in certain areas like health, we'll really push for innovation so as to better treat people for diseases. So that's scenario 1. Then you have a scenario with less constraints, a bit less frugal. Here, we're going to try to explain to people that they have to consume less. And here you have a reindustrialization of certain sectors. This is in scenario 2. In scenario 3, which is called green technologies, here we change society. In fact, we're going to work more with technology, little constraint, little in terms of evolutions of lifestyles. So here, the demand for energy will be about 30% less than in 2015. A strong development in use of the biomass, a strong deconstruction and new construction approach, even if you will have more new construction than in the preceding scenario. And then we'll also have recourse to hydrogen, obviously. And in scenario 4, we free things up. People consume as they want. We will place our wagers on technology, which will enable us to consume less energy, about 20% less than in 2015. But this to the detriment of the environment, a strong environmental impact because of the consumption of resources, irrigation. This is the scenario where we exploit the poles, the underwater riches as well. this is not science fiction. This is something that's already being prepared, you know. So one of the wagers there is to capture, the carbon in the air, the capture and sequestration of carbon. So here, there are limits to technology, but there's no magic technology. Now, if we were to summarize things somewhat, next slide, if we were to look at the problems linked to these different scenarios, well, next slide, please. The first scenario, in fact, is a sociological wager to change behaviors fast in a rapid and broad manner. The second one counts on people's intelligence, that they understand their way of life has to evolve. The third one is a kind of peak between decarbonization without modifying lifestyles in depth. The fourth scenario is that technological innovation is going to enable us to succeed, and this without modifying lifestyles. With 1 and 2, we can achieve carbon neutrality with a very little new specific technology. In 3, you have obviously carbon capture and sequestration, and in the fourth one you have more of that. So this is a description. This is a description, a societal description. You have all kinds of graphs, all kinds of explanations. Here we can look at a few of them. I think that as far as your concerns are concerned, I think the societal issues are the most important ones, obviously. And from this work, we have drawn some very advanced scientific and technical research work showing the interaction between sectors. There are 5 society possibilities. How far can we go in terms of frugality? Because frugality is not just one single point. We're also talking about products and services. This is a sector like the construction sector, which is going to have to organize itself. Agriculture is also going to have to transform itself. You have to reduce the inputs, for example. And how far can we go in that transformation?
How far is the population willing to commit? And the second thing is about natural wells. And more we can base this on natural wells in our exercise, because we haven't looked at the ocean side of it. How can we manage to both use what's natural and keep this the way it is, and use the forest as well to produce energy, to have materials for all of the ecosystemic purposes. The third thing is about the food regimen in France. That's 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to obtain but we don't want to touch the food or farming. That's not possible to do that. So there are 2 strong elements. First of all, in 1 and 2, reduction of consumption of red meat, of beef, notably, that emit a lot of methane, and also farming with very little input, where we can reach the 50% of emission in the farming sector, which is a French objective. The fourth one has to do with buildings. Is a building economy in a society where we build 30% less, or even 100% less in 2050 than we are building today? And lastly, an industrial model. What is an industry that is decarbonating, which is not that easy if you want to reduce by 80% carbon coming from industry? That's not that easy. And what is the model when you're selling goods that are sustainable, repairable, with the eco-design for that enable that functionality. So what does that industrial model mean to succeed in reaching that? And it has to be reinvented, basically. Building for repair. So this is very short, but you have a site on the internet that you can see in the next slide, transition2050.adem.fr, where you will find the report that I cited, 687 pages. If you have insomnia, you can read that. And if not, and you don't have much time, you have the executive summary of 12 pages, which is more a societal vision. There's 44 pages, which is a bit more technical. If you want to look at the hypotheses and the graphics and changes in impact, and those are also available in English, so you can look at those in English. And there are other documents, either in French or in English. So all of that is available on that site, which you have there, transitions2050.adem.fr. Thank you for that overview, which I'm sure there'll be questions about. Before getting to the questions, we're going to be having a look now at the change in our perception of energy, thanks to the invention of Claire. Claire, the floor is yours. Thank you, Arnaud.
Charts are in French, so everybody has something. And it's actually quite appropriate that I speak in this table, because we are also, what I'm going to say is based on the studies that we made. First, maybe one word to say EPE is Entreprise pour l'Environnement. It's an association of about 60 companies, international and French, all sectors, working together on environment, climate, biodiversity, resources, and so on. Maybe I could have... Est-ce que je peux avoir la présentation? Vous l'avez dans le... C'est celle qui était là juste... Voilà. Thank you very much. Next. So we have been working on ecological transition for a long time, and actually started to work on carbon neutrality when France declared in 2017 that the objective was carbon neutrality for France in 2050, which was at the time unbelievable. Industry believed this was impossible. But science is confirmed. The IPCC and IPBES are absolutely continuing to alert, as we have seen. We know the causes. We know the business world starts to know that it's no business on a dead planet. And we also all know that what we are doing now is important, but not sufficient. Au Conseil pour le Climat is criticizing, Justice is talking. Climate policies today and climate action go towards something like 3 degrees and are continuing to destroy biodiversity. And 3 youngsters in France out of 4 are actually frightened by the future. This is massive for business. The youngsters are not with us. What should we do? And so what we see is that ecological transition is now today a need, a societal need. It's a lot of expectations, but how do we do? What should I do? What can I do? Who should do what? So it's more questions of governance and decision-making processes. In 2017, next chart, in 2017, we decided to look into this carbon neutrality subject with, is this possible? And is it still an economic world? What is it? Is business compatible with this carbon neutrality? So we decided to do a collective exploration funded by business to see what this means for France. We decided to do all sectors, but only on France, because it's some sort of a mock-up. We had the data easier. And we wanted to look at the global picture, including sociology, including what it means for people and what it means for all sectors. And since we finished this study in 2019, it was in the middle of the Yellow Vest movement. So we decided to have a citizen consultation, a dialogue, citizen dialogue, and stakeholder consultation, which led to this publication of Zen 2050 for zero emission net in 2050. The message is clear, with actually quite encouraging results. The 3 main questions, next chart, were answered positively, meaning that carbon neutrality of France is possible without exporting emissions or without stopping life. It is compatible with economic growth, and it is also compatible with diversified and comfortable ways of life for people. It's not everybody with the same hut and candle. But it is a transformation, an unprecedented transformation. Next chart. As you see, it is a minus 4.5 per year reduction. As you have seen in Corrine's presentation, we are more around 1 or 2. It is unprecedented, except that in France, we have actually closed coal. The coal business was closed about at this speed during the 70s and 80s, but it was only one sector and 2 regions, north and east, but they have been suffering, and everybody is still remembering this. So when we say unprecedented, it says it is extremely difficult, and to be frank, it is still more difficult now, because since we are not in 2015, we are in 2022, now it would be more like 5.5%. It is huge, and it is counting on a rather optimistic view of absorption, increased absorption by agriculture and forestry, and enormously reduced emissions, of course, in all sectors, agriculture being the least under constraint, because, of course, they are in open air, so it is only divided by 2, but the rest is minus 90%, minus 70%. It's a massive transformation. And the main thing we have taken from this study is that it is conditions for success. Next chart. Basically, we have to do everything. Next chart means we have to do everything. We need everybody and every solution and every part of the society, including, and this is the most new part of the study of the results, is that we need the citizens, consumers. And they are also the working force. They are everybody. They are also the people with money that they put in the bank, and so on. Of course, we know we have the role of economic actors is huge. They have to develop solutions. They have to transform the production tool, to do the professional transition. Everybody has to work with climate and ecological transition in their job and in their functions. They have to fund investment, and they have to do this responsible marketing, which I will come back to. Of course, policymakers, we know that they have to explain what it means to do this transition. They have to put the laws together, make some obligations, probably a little bit more forceful than has been the case today, to do the equity. So it has to be equitable. We have to help the poor people that are also the most vulnerable to do this transition, to make this transition affordable. They have to help innovation investment, and they have to do the negotiation at the international level. But the citizens, consumers, they have a huge role as well, because they will have to change their ways of life. And you cannot expect that they change their ways of life without asking them to do so and explaining what it means and explaining what is good into it and what is difficult and how they will be helped to do this. They have, for example, to renovate the housing. We are talking about renovation. Houses will not be renovated without the people ordering the work. And even if it was for free, it's a difficult thing to do. Because when do we do it, how much? So it's a prise de tête, as we say in French. And so they have to participate actively and positively. They have to want to do it or to accept to be forced to do it. Same on the food. Of course, it's a trend of less meat, but it has to be a little bit more faster and to continue. So it cannot be just, we cannot just expect that they have to be active in it. Obviously, in the mobility and habitat, do I live close to my job or do I live far and have to take my car and my wife a second car? And what is, how do we do that? And this is conscious, difficult, changing decisions. And of course, the rest of consumption. So what it means is that they have to review their way of what a good life is. And the role of energy in what the good life is very important and critical. They have to be prepared for a higher price of energy. And how do we do that? I will come back on this marketing, responsible marketing and communication, which is the next thing we did after this study was published. We decided to to work on this, because economic actors do create the way people see what a good life is. Advertising is really important in the way people want to live. So what is advertising doing in this way? That's where we have created this mixed working group, including marketing directions of our members and marketing and communication directorates and sustainable development teams to work together on how can advertising go faster in the direction, how can we teach through advertising what ecological transition means to the people and the way, what sort of a life should we desire. And we know how powerful advertising is in doing this. It has been actually difficult because it is a conflict. Do we want to sell more or do we want to sell sustainable things? What do we promote? You see, it's really a long-term, short-term questions that are internal to business and that we have finally got to some deliverables. And the first deliverable is this Stereotypes of Ecological Transition, which is the main part of my presentation. And actually, it's a publication, which you will see here. It's in English from today. Because of you, it is also available in English on our website. We accelerated the process a little bit. And it is, of course, in French, which is based on what has been done on gender diversity or cultural diversity in advertising. You know this approach of stereotypes of gender diversity. You were seeing these women helping men or doing the food, cooking. It has advertising, the advertising profession has been very careful to change the stereotypes, and it works indeed. So we decided to work into this direction, and we produced this guide for the advertising community of stereotypes that are good or bad for ecological transition, compatible or not compatible with ecological transition. Next chart. And then I will come back to that. So this becoming aware of stereotypes helps the profession to change a little bit and to have these representations of what a good life is change in people's mind unconsciously. And that's what advertising is made for. So we identified 10 stereotypes. We did not want to be too long or too prescriptive, but so they were selected to be efficient and describe them. Explain why they are important for ecological transition, show levers, what should we show, what are the solutions, instead of promoting something which is not good for ecological transition, can we promote a tool that is actually better? It's a scale, where you see, should be more often, should be systematic. Some representation should be systematic, some should be more often, some should be less often, and some should really be, can we avoid it? And then a lot of illustrations and images to show what we meant. So I will give you these 10 stereotypes quickly, and you will see that most of them, of course, have something to see with energy. Next chart. Carnivore compulsive, this is not compulsive carnivore, this is not energy, it is meat. It's not unexpected, but it's, I mean, when you show people and a nice meal, family meal or friend's meal, it's very often a big chicken or roast on the table. Can we do something different? Of course, the next one is much more energy related, since it is this fossil-fueled mobility, which is extremely often in advertising. The conquistador is more related to the link with nature. And again, this is not made only for climate. It is made for climate and biodiversity. And the relationship with nature, where you see this conquistador with a big SUV in a fantastic, pristine environment on a road, because that's the regulation, but the pristine environment is conquest. An object of conquest, so we wanted to identify this as no, SUV are not a normal way to use a car. It's exceptional. Autosolist is very much energy related, obviously. Autosolist, I think solo driver is a English word. Yes, shared mobility. We all know that shared mobility, public transportation, walking and biking, soft mobilities are the way to the future. Why should we show always a guy, sometimes a woman, but more seldom a woman, alone in their cars? The fifth one is not linked directly to energy, Zog. It is a detached house fantasy. The representation of the house people are living is actually promoting this living in a pavilion with a small garden in a suburb. And this is actually one of the most powerful stereotypes against ecological transition. Because if you live in a distant suburb, you have 2 cars, you are 30 kilometers times 4 a day, and then you cannot save energy. Plus a small pavilion, even if it is new, it has 6 sides, and so it is more difficult to isolate and renovate. So it's really a biggie. Next chart. The next one is directly energy related. I mean, you have these representations of people in T-shirts with snow flowing down, and this is not a way to represent winter. You should have a jumper. Let's avoid to represent that it is normal to live in a T-shirt during winter in Europe. Then, of course, the beach on the other side of the world is using a lot of energy, and we have fantastic beaches on this side of the world. So why should we always promote different beaches? And so this is also a lot of energy. Can we try to find nice places to have holidays without too much energy consumption? And then consumption is overconsumption. Linking happiness and consumption is a very, very, very frequent stereotype. This always faster, ever faster, is also related to energy. We spend a lot of energy to accelerate. Do we really need that? And so this is, can we do the same? And after all, slower is sometimes better. And we have these movements coming up. And then the last one is this fantasized nature, which is more the relationship with nature, because, again, we always represent either a fantastic nature where we are dominating it, or a garden with an absolutely clean lawn, and this is not what nature should be if we want any sort of biodiversity. So it's not energy related, but it is important to the ecological transition as well. So next chart. For each of these stereotypes, we have an illustration of what is recommended, what is to be avoided if possible, and alternatives. You see these people repairing this watch, luxury watch, I can tell you, or this nature with both fossil-fueled mobility, with a link to nature, with this fantasist nature in this Toyota Let's Go Places. So that's the illustration. All I wanted to do is that we are now promoting this guide. Next chart. We are now promoting this guide as a tool for training the advertising community. It is well received because many youngsters in this community, many are young and creative, and they did not know what to do. What does it mean that I could be more ecologic? What should I do? And this is actually giving some soft indications of what can be done, and we hope it will be used. We hope that more and more companies will use it, commit to use it, and it will be as successful as a gender or diversity stereotypes awareness and action. One word on the third, on the last thing we did is that we are also trying on, well, no, I will stop here. Sorry, I'm not going. Thank you.
Merci Claire.
Thank you, Claire. We'll know a bit more, perhaps, thanks to the questions that will be asked about that third point that you'll speak about. But now it's time to have an exchange with the floor. Comments on your part? Questions? I have the micro, so I'm also going to indicate that there are glasses and water in the corridor just in back here, but please keep your glass and reuse it throughout the day. So don't hesitate to take your glass and go fill it up, but keep the same glass. There's several hands raised, so I guess we can hand the microphone around pretty quickly. We'll take a series of questions and then a second series. So we'll do the first series first.
Okay, thank you very much to everybody, and thanks for the presentations. I'm a member from Ireland, and like everybody in the room, I'm sure also I'm very concerned about the future and sustainability, and making sure we preserve the capacity of the next generation to enjoy the fruits of the planet just like we've done. But in relation to a direct question to the panelists, do you believe that it's possible to achieve carbon neutrality in agriculture and feed 10 billion people going forward? Because that will be critical. And the second point would be in relation to plant proteins versus meat. A lot of the scientists indicate, and in scientific papers suggest, that plant proteins lack a lot of essential amino acids that are contained within red meat. So I would like to have the science illustrated at every public platform in order to make sure that we have full information. And I'll rest that one there. And then the final point is, in the panel's opinion, have they given a lot of consideration to food produced, particularly plant proteins, that require irrigation? Because about 80% of the food produced on the planet needs irrigation, and I'm not so sure have we done all the calculuses and the calculations behind the sustainability of irrigation for food production. So thank you very much for everybody and all their contributions.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentations and the clarity within which the ideas were presented. I'm a member, I'm from Portugal, and I think according to the scenarios that were presented, to combat climate change, no one can be left out. All actors must be more and better interested in ways to reverse adverse effects out of the climate. It is indeed necessary to change habits and processes in order to stop climate change. We live in a society that has had the luxury of making a product that was made to be indestructible, disposable, which is plastic. As consumers, we must be aware of this. And that's why we must change our ways of consumption, look for alternative, more sustainable and ecological solutions. Companies that produce consumer goods must also be able to provide their consumer with more sustainable products, where there is less waste, where production is local, and tons of fuel are not spent to bring the products across the world. Thinking only of Europe, could the introduction of incentives for local production and reduction of the use of plastic in the production process have a significant impact on the fight against climate change? That's my question. Thank you.
Alors, j'ai une question pour chacun des intervenants.
I have a question for each speaker.
La première, en fait,
The
pour
first
Jean-Louis Bergey.
is for Jean-Louis Bergey.
Vous parliez de,
You were talking
sur le sujet des puits à carbone,
about carbon sinks
replantation,
and replanting, reforestation as a possible solution
pour la captation du CO2
for CO2 capture
mais,
in the forest.
on n'évoque pas,
But we are not speaking
les sols agricoles.
about agricultural land, farming land. We have farming that is supported on the European level by the agricultural policy, which is a model which impoverishes the soil and which uses a huge amount of inputs into the soil, producing greenhouse gas emissions as well. So this would be a solution to have, to encourage a farming model that would be to conserve soil and to optimize carbon capture. So why don't we encourage this on the European level to farmers to be for more responsible farming? And for Tutenuit, there was, in the Citizen Convention for the Climate, there were interesting proposals for regulating advertising. Here we see a proposal that is based on the good wishes of people. What, according to you, how much regulation do we need to apply in this respect? And BVP, which is the French advertising bureau that verifies advertising, which is a moderator as well, could they intervene in having advertisers be more responsible in the type of advertising stereotypes they use or do away with?
Thank you very much. My name is Simo Tiainen. I'm a member of this committee from Finland, and thank you so much for all the panelists. Very interesting and very good panel. And I would have several questions, but I restrict to perhaps to these scenarios presented by Jean-Louis Bergey, that different scenarios to achieve the carbon neutrality. But my question is that, was that in any of those scenarios the production of the energy? In your scenarios there was that we have to consume less and the use of the energy, but in my mind the biggest thing is that how the energy is produced and should be produced without fossil fuels. And just what has happened in recent days, I think we have to urge to get a dependency on the energy in Europe itself. So my question is that the use of energy, and I didn't hear, for instance, any word of the nuclear, this secret word. This was not heard this morning. Thank you so much.
Alors, on peut peut-être prendre une dernière question et après on
So maybe one last question, and then we'll have the answers, and then a second series of questions.
Bonjour.
Hello, my name is Lucy. I'm a student, and I'm one of the 3 out of the 4 young people who are afraid for the future. This is why I'm present here today, and I have a question for Mr. Bergey. This concerns the frugal scenario, where you say that we should interest ourselves more in low-tech. So I would like to know whether the French Agency for Ecological Transition, the ADEME, is supporting the deployment of low-tech thanks to a call for projects. My second question is for Mrs. Tutenuit. You speak of stereotypes in advertising. I asked myself a question. I would like to know whether by changing our vacation destinations, could we have in advertising that would respect the environment and ecology more? I don't think it's possible, in fact, but my question is the following. Greenpeace and other organizations are appealing to, the end of the use of fossil fuels for aviation, maritime transport, etc. Do you think it's possible? I saw that Airbus was in the list of companies that took part in your study. So thank you for your opinion on these subjects. Thank you.
Donc merci. on prendra une deuxième série de questions ensuite.
Thank you. We'll take a second series of questions afterwards, okay? So we're going to start trying to answer these questions that were already asked. I've taken note that some of these questions were directly directed to the speakers at the table here. I also noticed that the first two questions did not address a specific speaker, but that they could perhaps be answered by Corrine Le Quéré, because they request information, scientific information on food, for example, in a world with billions of inhabitants. So, can we reduce this to achieve, in fact, carbon neutrality on the side of the agriculture with regards to the production of plants and animals, irrigation, etc., with regards to alternatives to plastic? The drop in use of plastics, promoting local consumption, this is also linked to food. Is this an interesting approach to fight climate change? Mrs. Le Quéré, would you like to answer these first two questions? Yes, absolutely.
I will take the answer in English, given the question was in English. Thank you very much. On the scenarios for carbon neutrality, this is a question that is explored very deeply for a long time, whether it is possible to reach carbon neutrality, given that we need to feed possibly 10 billion people, maybe not quite, and with all the implications for water. And the way that this is done scientifically, it's carefully assessed with the help of socioeconomic models that include the constraint for the trajectory towards carbon neutrality, so creating, enhancing those carbon sinks, and also the other constraint like producing food and sufficient water. And yes, actually, there are many, most models can deliver trajectories that reach carbon neutrality under these circumstances. The approach is greatly facilitated by reducing the use of energy, so lowering the use of energy, being more energy efficiency, being more frugal in some of our practices, and likewise for the emissions that are associated with agriculture, and in particular from eating red meat and dairy, which uses which emits more greenhouse gases for the proteins that are produced. So by both making the problem smaller and deploying the approach worldwide, then you can reach that conclusion. However, when we do this in practice, so like we are trying to do now, there are some big challenges that will need to be implemented. One is that the sustainability of the use of land is absolutely crucial, so that demand for carbon sinks in some places, typically in Europe, will not lead to deforestation elsewhere around the world. So sorting out all the details of this and the practices is extremely important. And that's why the adoption, the finalization of the Paris Agreement, which I mentioned in my presentation, that included the rules for accounting for carbon sink, was really important. And that has been done in Glasgow in 2021. So we need to be vigilant. We need to follow, monitor what is going on land, but certainly it is possible to do this. On the question about plant protein and food quality, we are monitoring for a long time across society the quality of the food. The biggest problem we have with food quality today is not associated with the issues that you raised, but there are big problems of obesity and other issues associated with this. And in fact, to introduce more sane alimentation, so food requirements in our menu would help to tackle health at the same time. So I would say that it's possibly we have an opportunity here to take by improving our diets to improve health in general. Certainly the issues of food quality that you raise will need to be tackled. When we talk about such a big transitions, there will be teething problems that will need to be addressed as we go along. On the last questions about plastic, plastics are not a big cause of carbon emissions. They are extremely important for sustainability. They cause waste. They get introduced in the biodiversity and cause damage to ecosystems. But in terms of emissions, it is not a big issue. Certainly tackling plastics will help to reduce emissions. Most of the emissions today come from our use of energy and burning fossil fuel for energy, power, and transport. Thank you.
Merci pour ces réponses et nous allons en apporter également aux questions
Thank you for
qui étaient
those
posées à
answers.
Claire
We're going
Tutenuit
to
en
answer
matière
the questions asked of Claire Tutenuit in terms of advertising. Her presentation, in fact, has highlighted the work on social stereotypes and has led to questions which say that beyond voluntary actions, are there measures, regulatory bodies and measures which could, in addition to voluntary measures, could help to develop new practices? So I'm not going to repeat the questions. I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Well, the first EP is not a lobbying organization. We are not passing messages to policymakers, and this is very important because we have no formalized answer to this question of should we do regulation. We don't work on this question. We work on the contrary, on the fact that voluntary action is a prerequisite to regulation. If you start with regulation without business being prepared, it does not work well. And so it is important to start with voluntary action, to start with commitments, and we do welcome this, that's also our business, to encourage voluntary action. And so we do encourage, and that's why we produce this guide, is that the profession starts to understand what it means. How can they do? What will they promote if regulation comes at some point? Should we forbid advertising for fossil fuels? It is already forbidden. You cannot have on the walls in France an advertising for a petrol station, gas station. So it is already, some is already done in this direction. Not everything, showing aircraft or distant holidays is not forbidden. It is also a big economic sector. France is a destination, the part of tourism in the French economy is huge. So France has a lot of aeronautical industry, as you know. And so it is obviously very difficult to say, well, we stop. Plus, the world economy is based on globalization, so business is also traveling. But the good news is we have all learned in the last 2 years to travel less. And holidays in France have become more popular in France, and probably holidays in Croatia have become more popular in Croatia in the last 2 years. So habits it might be also an opportunity in that direction. So should we forbid, we do believe it's early, but it is on the way. But the economic world has to know what is the new life. So this understanding of what society we are promoting has to be understood and co-built. It is not existing yet. We have these 4 scenarios. Which one are we going to take? Probably a little bit of each. This is not yet designed, and business has to realize what it means, and business and consumers and the society, before we can move to the next step of regulation. That's a personal interpretation of the situation.
Merci. Passons donc à présent aux questions qui étaient adressées à Jean-Louis Bergey, qui concernaient d'une part les sols, l'agriculture, que fait l'Europe en la matière, le mix énergétique ou les mix énergétiques imaginables qu'il y a derrière les scénarios présentés, le low-tech et l'ADEME, et donc nous allons entendre ces réponses à ce sujet.
So, can we have your answers?
Sur les puits naturels, il y a bien les sols, hein, c'est ce que j'ai indiqué.
So, you know, in the scenario, we've looked at the soils as well. The soils are included in our scenario.
On a une agriculture avec un très bas niveau d'intrants, puisque sur le 1, on
you
a
have an agriculture with very low inputs, because in one you have 100% organic, in the second one you have 50% organic. You have in the 3 and 4 you have extensive agriculture, extensive prairies as well. You have less land used for construction and development in general. So this means you are reconquering soils which between 3 and 4 are integrated. In 3 and 4 you continue to have intensive use of soils. So we have indeed integrated these soils. We're also working on a more fine-tuned approach with regards to the soils. This is what is going to be published in March. On the question of energy production, I didn't speak of that. And you need to know that, first of all, we looked at demand in each of the scenarios. What will the energy demand be? And then we looked at how we could bring this energy in different ways. Heat, electricity, intermediate sources like hydrogen, for example. We also looked at how we could decarbonize that energy used. We've done that work, and I didn't show you all of the graphs and slides, but depending on the scenario, you have different energy mixes. For example, gas in S4 is used less. In hydrogen, we have you have more in 1, 2, 3 than in 4. You don't have a lot. We have some refineries in France, mainland France, because as we said earlier, there are sectors which are very hard to decarbonize: road transportation, air transportation. And then as far as electricity is concerned, in scenario 1 and 2, we have the historical nuclear power plants with you have, and as well as the EPR at Flamanville. And for the rest, we develop renewable energy sources, solar and wind power, mostly land-based wind power, a little bit of offshore. In the third scenario, for the electricity, we either keep the historical nuclear and really push accelerate the speed in the offshore floating wind power, because it is felt that we've done as much as we could with land-based wind power in terms of acceptance, etc. The other option is we don't develop the offshore wind power. Instead, we build 3 additional EPRs. Then in scenario 4, we're not able to develop the electricity needed. So in this case, you develop the offshore wind power and 4 or 5 additional EPR nuclear power stations. Then it's clear that we can, in fact, exploit the forest land. We are thus going to need the capture and sequestration technology for carbon, because there's also the problem of sequestration of these millions of cubic meters. In France, we have 2 possibilities. In the north of France, in the old gas places in the southwestern part of France, where we used to have natural gas, and which has been exhausted. Then, if we're offered proposals of low-tech, we will go there. Then you have low-tech solutions at the territorial level that we support, because there's an interest in using that low-tech locally. But we also have calls for projects as well at the ADEME, because that is our function as a national state agency. So, there you have it. Let me simply add one thing. With regards to what Corrine Le Quéré said, you need to remember that 30% of agricultural products in the world are thrown away from production to the consumer. There's a lot of reflection to carry out on the wasted 30% of agricultural products for which on which we spend energy, water, human labor, which is then not consumed but wasted. Let me make a comment on agriculture here, because I think that this was one of the crucial points in our study. We were able to observe that everyone was looking at biomass, biomaterials, biofuels, biogas, food, and the capture and stocking and sequestration in the soil. So the use and development of biomass, should we produce bioplastics, for example, or what should we do? So these are issues which are crucial for this decade, and between the enterprises, companies discussing this, it's very difficult, because this bioenergy is a real tense subject with intensification of agriculture and the question of biodiversity. There's a scenario by IDRI regarding the agrotechnology. It shows that Europe would be could be autosufficient in the field of food, and using these soils and with an acceptable approach. So these are subjects that will be very much in the discussion, with food diets, which would be quite different, obviously. Thank you for the different speakers for these answers. We have 10 minutes before we go outside to go have a group picture, and then the lunch break. You know that there are a few hands being raised for another 4 questions. Very short answers and short questions as well, please, so as to respect the time.
Rudolf Kolbe from Austria, member of this group 3, coming from the architect construction sector, and therefore I would have had hundreds of questions, but many of them have already been asked, fortunately, and so I will come back to this sector. You, Mr. Bergey, and also Ms. Tutenuit, sorry for the bad pronunciation, have mentioned many things. Also, a big thank you to, I say Claire, that's easier for me. You have begun your presentation with, you have discovered it is possible. that is an optimism we need, and we need in all our communications to motivate also the people that they should engage in these processes. Both of you, and I think also the Madame Le Quéré, has mentioned we need the consumer and the citizen. And how do you think we can motivate them? What about transparency in the processes? I give you a short example. If you have a tender for construction work, normally you will get the cheapest offer to be built because nobody is counting on what will this building consume in the future. Do you think it would be good to have a label as we have for a fridge, not only for the energy consumption at the moment, but for the total life cycle? That could be. And what about education? How can we get not only a sophisticated society to follow the rules, but all of them? What's with the young citizens in the kindergarten? So where can we reach them? Can you give us some answers to that ideas? Thank you.
Merci, oui, s'il vous plaît, essayons de faire court.
Thank you. Let's try to have short questions,
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I have also a lot of questions, but I will ask only Mr. Bergey. Thank you for this research and foresight presentation of the process and scenarios. I'm interested in the further process, how your findings, recommendations from all this really comprehensive process will be adopted or implemented in public policies. Do you have still these silos policies, or you have kind of holistic or integrated approach? I think that's the crucial step, how these findings can be implemented in future. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman, and hello to the speakers, and excellent presentations, and that's shown by the amount of questions. I would just ask the panelists first, do ye accept that emissions from livestock is part of a biogenic cycle, where it just continues to go round and round without creating any more? The carbon that they emit is broken down after 10 or 12 years. It's absorbed by the plants through photosynthesis. It's eaten by the animals to produce perfect, nutritious food. It's methane is emitted, or that is eaten by the people. The methane is emitted, goes into the atmosphere, broken down, and the whole cycle just starts up and rolls over again. So it's just part of a biogenic cycle. I'd also like to ask the panelists, can ye be certain and say 100% that the reduction in food output as a result of the Green Deal, which by all accounts is going to be give or take 16 to 20% across Europe, across the EU, an EU where the food production is the most traceable, it's the most transparent, it's the most controlled, it's the safest, the best quality anywhere in the world, that when that's reduced, and then we see Secretary in America, Secretary Vilsack, looking for like-minded countries to come together to fill that vacuum that's going to be left by the reduction in food output in the EU. Can you be certain that that will not lead to carbon leakage? Because I can't see anything else. Because, you know, it's applaudable to try and talk about the ideal world, but there is a real world there, and the real world states that regardless of trends, regardless of advertising, the demand for meat and dairy will increase by between 1 and 1.5% annually over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I would say let's work with the farmers. Let's work with European farmers that have shown over the past 30 years they've increased output by 25% and reduced carbon emissions by 25%. So that shows there's an awareness there. Let's support them. Let's produce food where we have good control over it, because we're going to need that food. It has been shown by 2050 we'll need between 60 and 98% more food than we have at present. Thanks, Chairman.
Il y a deux personnes, j'en avais compté 4, mais bon.
There's 2 more people. I had counted 4, but there's 1 more. And then there's another person.
Short questions and 2 linked to context, so I will have to mention that as well. Mr. Bergey, you mentioned that we will have to reduce by 50%, and that's the French goal, the red meat production. How much of this meat is linked to milk production, and how much is grown only for red meat? Perhaps you can just give me the figures to better understand the challenge. The second is to Mrs. Tutenuit. You said actually you talked about stereotypes, but in your language, I found one tricky point where you say citizens dot consumers. Although the points which you were mentioning were mainly about citizens, well, attitude. Consumer is like, I feel like meat. I am targeted, but I don't, where my brain is not really involved. So I would prefer using only the term citizen, and in the citizen's perspective, of course, good consumption practice, which I do. But this wording plays a key role, I think, as well in changing attitudes. And the things with context. We are in a situation of war, and these situations, they, in most cases, turn out in big disasters, but in some aspects, they might have as well big motivation for change. And I think as peace movement, democracy movement, and environmental movement, they have the same roots. We talked with Lutz on this yesterday, the entire evening, and they are interlinked very closely. How do you see, how can we get the best synergies out of the current situation where environmental movement might strengthen the democracy and peace movement, which is in immediate attack, and and vice versa, because I think we have to look wider, not the immediate, well, in both, because oil industry, chemistry industry is bombed in Ukraine, which is causing immediate environment risks, but also wider. And that's the second question with this context. I think in a time when bombs and rockets are flying, is still the French attitude towards nuclear energy, is that, and I think it is also a question to Hungary and Finland. I think it is we cannot see those nuclear plants as safe anymore. Sorry. Even in France, France seems far away from Ukraine, but we have terrorists in leading states with fast rockets, and these might be misused if we don't protect ourselves and prepare ourselves now, because the dangers won't go away. Putin will be killed or bombed, or he will take his suicide in his bunker, but the risks will stay, and I think the risks are linked as well to nuclear plants.
Bonjour à tous, je vais essayer d'être rapide parce que je pense qu'on a déjà dépassé un peu le temps. Je m'appelle François Dubreuil, je travaille à Ville de Paris sur les questions de transition écologique et de résilience.
Economic transition. In fact, I'd like to draw your attention to one factor. Michael Goyer published at the beginning of 2022 a book called Climatics Criminals, where he observes that the big companies worldwide, the biggest ones, you know, the ones that pollute the most, Peru's 70% of greenhouse gases, and the three biggest polluters are Armaco, China Energy, and Gazprom. They can, by themselves, totally deregulate the climate. So what are the ways that Europe can leverage? What are the possibilities to counter these multinational companies? Thank you for that last question. Very short question.
Donc, j'ai relevé 8 questions.
There are 8 questions
Finalement 5 intervenants.
And 5 speakers.
Déjà 13h03.
It's already after 1.
Vers le secrétariat.
So I'm going to turn towards the Secretariat and the Chair to see how much time can we take. Another 10 minutes. We'll try to respond in 10 minutes. We might not be able to answer all of those questions, but we'll pick up the same order that we had earlier, very freely, the 3 speakers to respond freely to the questions they wish to respond to, very briefly. And if you wish to continue the exchange, if you don't have an answer, then you can try to do that as soon as we have time. Thank you for your comprehension. So the floor is over to Corrine. Thank you much for these questions.
So on the first, I will take the first 2, if I may. On the first about the consumer transparency from the gentleman from Austria. Thank you very much. I mean, you're completely right that the level of intervention needs to be on the offer to the customer. The example you gave is perfect with the building constructions and labels. The issue that we have now is that the whole of society is stuck in this network of infrastructure that is reliant on fossil fuel, and we cannot let everything the way they are and then at the very end tell the customers, please don't use this particular thing or service because it emits too much greenhouse gases. We have to intervene as much as possible at the very start to make sure that the offer to the customer is a low carbon offer with all that it involves in terms of structural changes. On the question, I think was the third question about the methane emission, and whether this is part of a natural cycle, the way you're portraying it, it's exact. However, it's not because the emissions return to the natural cycle that they do not warm the climate. In this case, we have perturbed the natural cycle. Methane emissions contribute about 1/3 of the warming we see today. So if we were to completely stop, I'm not suggesting we do it now, but if we were to completely stop livestock rearing, then 1/3 of the warming that we have had today from human activity would go away within 10 years. So this is a very substantial lever that we have to rely less on livestock. The second point that you made about the reduction in food output in Europe, you're absolutely right that if this happens and only displaces the food demand elsewhere and production elsewhere for imports, then in fact we do not solve our problem and we may even make it worse. However, if the reduction in food output in Europe is accompanied and even driven by a reduction in demand through management of waste and through the evolution of diets, then we have a significant effect on the emissions of Europe and on the global emissions. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions.
Merci pour ces réponses donc à 2 des questions posées.
Thank you very much for the response to 2 questions, Claire.
Yes, thank you very much. I would actually jump on what Corrine just said to say, yes, this all confirms, and your question on citizen versus consumer confirms the importance of consumer involvement and also this ambiguity we all have internally. It's a joke in business that people, even activists, when they enter a shop, they leave environment at the door. We have our own contradictions. We want to live where we want to live and go on holiday even if we are activists. So people are not going to move all at the same time, all in the same direction, all at the same pace. But that's where the balance between this story, the representation of how this transition should go and how it can go, That is important because everybody will find their own path and be both a citizen and a consumer and find a way which is difficult. And at some point, they go to the elections and they go to shops. And is everybody consistent with himself doing this? The society has to make consistency, and it is extremely key that advertising is not delivering messages that are in contradiction with what the societal concern calls for, which is an ecological transition. So that's why it is important to bring them closer, more consistent. In terms of the synergy with today's situation, I think, yes, it can be seen as a sign, if not an opportunity. The first sign, well, you mentioned the risk on nuclear. I would have said two other things at least, which is one, we see competition for land is worse than ever, is hardest than ever. We have mentioned the role of agriculture and food and energy production, and the soil is more key than ever. And the second message is really the vulnerability of energy prices and the importance of managing our demand in energy to be less vulnerable into to risks that are going to be not lighter, not lower than they were. Risks are, I mean, they will be increased by climate change. We are going to have drought, and food production will be reduced not only by the different practice, but also by drought. And yes, it's going to be more tension, and we have to be less vulnerable and build our own resilience to this, doing the ecological transition.
Merci. Jean-Louis, quelques mots aussi.
Thank you. Jean-Louis, a few words?
Oui, assez rapidement.
Very quickly, yes.
Merci, notre collègue autrichien.
Thank you to the colleague who's talking about citizen mobility. It's a long question, so I can't do a global answer, but I want to insist on 2 points. The first of which is that I think if we want to get mobilized, we have to talk about it in public discussions, in political discussions. For a long time, we've shown that in the questions that political journalists ask during the presidential campaign, there were 2 or 4% of the questions had to do with the environment. That's all. So if you don't talk about it, it's hard to mobilize citizens, even if lots of citizens would be mobilized. Talking about the youth as well. The second thing is, I'll give you a concrete example. There's a community that creates bicycle paths that are relatively safe and nice and so forth. There are people that will be testing those paths, and they're going to realize that ultimately it's good to use your bicycle rather than the car all by yourself. By giving an experiment, by having an experiment, you can show that objects can be repaired, so you don't have to buy new objects. So I think there's a very concrete aspect of these things which show that things can actually be done. And it's not, back to the candle. The other question that Madam had about work, I'm not going to say that we had a holistic or systemic approach. However, we had a multi-criteria approach. We look at the impacts of carbon neutrality with respect to water, the quality of air, the quality of the soil, notably. We wanted to work on biodiversity, but we didn't have the tools to do so. There wasn't a systemic approach, but we're aware that we need to do some serious thinking about these two approaches. And we talk about living things is at the heart of all of that. It needs to feed us, it needs to warm us, to bring food, it needs to let us walk in the woods or in the country. How do we maintain the balance? Now, about our scenarios, that was the demand of the gentleman. We don't have one scenario, we have 4. And we're dividing consumption of meat by 3, dividing it by 3. And number 4, we have an increase. There are health concerns, which was explained earlier by Corrine. The health aspects are important as well. So it's mainly meat. Milk products will not move much, to keep it simple, including bones. I think we've responded about carbon. I'm not a specialist in war and policy. We will need materials and goods and services. The more we can produce our own energy, and that would be near the site, the more resilient we would be. And we saw the pandemic, that was a big issue. And it gives questions about reindustrialization in Europe. So we'll be more resilient. I'm not a specialist in nuclear and nuclear safety, so I can't respond on that. But there is that idea as well, but without being autarcic. That's not the question. But the closer we will be, the more we can be separate from what happens elsewhere. Also, there's the climate change issues about farming and forest and so forth. That is here. Those issues are here. It's not because we're a bit more local that we're, get away from everything else that's not local. Thank you very much to all of you for your answers and the questions. I see that there's just one question that is still open, having to do with the 100 companies that emit 70% of greenhouse gases and what we can do to change that. I think that since this morning and this afternoon, we're going to be continuing to provide responses because in a certain sense, this is linked to, voluntary aspects, but maybe constraints as well. The regulations are evolving at all levels, highly in European level right now. A lot of changes. And here, civil society organizations in Europe are well positioned to be able to respond to that. We just spoke about citizen actions as voting or consumers, voting citizens or consumers, and groups get organized depending on what interests them, and together they can carry these demands to decision makers and talk about practices. So let's continue along those lines during our day's exchanges and the opening up to dialogue and keep opening our minds. We're going to take a picture now, just outside of the building, before the lunchtime break, which will probably, it's a 1 o'clock break.